Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture, which launches the new Models lecture series for this academic year. The series, which began last autumn, has invited architects and other interdisciplinary practitioners to discuss how their work can change the models around which society is organized. Each event proposes a new model to address how we can shift power structures, socio-economic forces, and structural inequalities present in society today to give us new tools to rethink the world around us. Over the past year, a series of new models have been presented to underline the need to redesign institutions, redress who has access to funding, reverse the lack of representation in public art, embrace physical and digital spaces of collective care, find new forms of community-led practice, invent new forms of recognition, and address the interconnected and intersectional crises threatening the future of our planet. And that's just to name a few, with more to come in the year ahead. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Manisha Verghese, and I'm the head of the AA's public program. And I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, who through her practice that spans art, writing, education, and so many other things, has worked with inclusive social frameworks to invent new forms of conversation and spaces for collective empowerment. So Esther Choi is a New York-based multidisciplinary artist trained in photography and architectural history, whose artwork, writing, and scholarship explore how concepts of nature, marginality, and identity have shaped and been shaped by world-making practices and technologies. She's an adjunct associate professor at the Cooper Union and a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. Tonight, she'll discuss a new model for mutuality, questioning how we, as architects and designers, can operate as social and political agents to transform society in a significant and lasting way. Having set up office hours in 2020 as an online social experiment to bring together creative practitioners who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, Esther's created, 38 hours and counting of inspirational content, conversation, and most importantly, community. Having been lucky enough to attend a few of these sessions over the last year, thanks to being introduced to them by Shumi Bose, who's also here tonight, I can only speak to the incredible feeling of both being inspired and also overcome with emotion to be part of such an engaged and important group and community, even just for an hour. And this space of empowerment, encouragement, and collective opportunity felt so rare, especially during a time of isolation and separation. It's something truly special and unique to be able to create that space for those who need it, especially online. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing Esther tell us more about where the idea for office hours came from, how it has evolved, and the new model for mutual support that it advocates for. Before I hand over to her, a few notes on the format. Esther will give her lecture, and following that, I'll ask a couple of questions before opening it up to the audience for a wider discussion. Throughout the talk, feel free to post your questions in the chat at any point, and I can ask it on your behalf, or else use the raise hand function and I can unmute you and you can ask it yourself. And if you feel comfortable to do so, and I'm pleased that at least a few of you have done this already, but please turn on your camera, especially during the conversation, so we can feel in some way like we're in the same space, despite this series still being held online. But I guess above all, I'm really excited to have Esther join us tonight for this talk and also to kind of kick off the series this term. So please join me in welcoming her to the AA.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to speak to you today virtually from Brooklyn, New York, the unceded territory of the Lenape people. Though I must admit, I was really looking forward to meeting you in person. But I hope that having in-person dialogue safely will be in our not too distant future. And I'm so grateful to Manager for the invitation to contribute to such an inspiring lecture series with a crucial mandate of sharing new models that aspire to, really reimagine the world anew. And I think in this moment, which feels very much like a turning point, spaces for such discussions, both inside and outside of the academy, are desperately needed. So maybe what I'll do is I'll share my screen now. Now, what the online format does allow for is dialogue with people from all over the world, folks living in different time zones and strangers placed in relative proximity, representing many walks of life. The format of the global conversation in particular has become oddly familiar to me. In the past 15 months, I've been sustained by connections with now thousands of people representing the global majority in over 19 countries. Now, I know this sounds a bit strange, so let me explain. In the early summer of 2020, I, like you, found myself self-quarantined in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, spurred by the structural defects exposed by the pandemic and the global response to systemic racism directed at Black communities and other communities of color in North America, we were all challenged to reconsider how the concepts of community and immunity are reciprocal, just as the philosopher Roberto Esposito has explored in his work. So it was during this moment of intense fear, confusion, and solidarity that I participated in conversations outside of the academy with groups of architects, artists, historians, and curators of color. We'd convene regularly to reflect on the conditions in which we teach and learn and practice the crafts of what we do as image makers, world builders, and storytellers. Now, the shared frustrations and energy exchanged in these conversations, as well as other circumstances and conditions of possibility that I'll soon describe, is what led me to initiate a socially engaged project rooted in intersectional justice called Office Hours. And the project aimed to cultivate the sharing of world-making knowledge amongst creative practitioners that identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC. I know in the UK, it's, you often use the term BAME. Since July 15th, 2020, Office Hours has convened 35 free events online, and more than 2,000 people of the global majority in 19 countries have abided by its community agreements to participate in this ongoing social experiment that sought to privilege and practice the values of mutuality, nonviolence, and collective empowerment, rather than singularity, domination, and competition. So as a way to frame and explain the philosophical and dialogical frameworks of Office Hours, I've structured my comments as provocations in roughly 4 parts rather than as a linear argument. First, I'll briefly share the personal and the professional stakes that motivated the creation of Office Hours and the contours of how it's structured, how it operates, its participants, its values. Then I'll discuss my central proposition, which is that acknowledging architecture and design as social practices and thereby recalibrating the social systems by which narratives and methodologies of world-making are written, accessed, and disseminated and practiced might produce fundamental shifts to how these material practices touch and affect the world. In other words, what I've learned from this nascent project is that the integrity by which a model or a discipline is created always radiates outwards. Third, I'll offer some thoughts on what it means for us to consider mutuality as a central component in reconceptualizing the praxis of being human, a phrase that I take from Sylvia Wynter. To reconceptualize a practice of being human in its fullest capacity as decolonial subjects necessitates defining what mutuality means outside of cultural norms, what mutuality might mean outside of and in relation to self-interest, and how new vocabularies for difference without division and rank might look and feel. Finally, I'll discuss the importance of fostering and sharing new world-building strategies as a form of direct political action. The incredible sociologist of science, Ruha Benjamin, said it best when she said, quote, "The imagination is a contested field of action, a battleground, an input and output of technology and social order. Most people are forced to live inside someone else's imagination." How great is that? I love that quote. Now, I want to emphasize that the creation of new cultural infrastructures designed to foster the growth and sharing of the imagination by people of color to produce new schemes based on respect and accountability towards others and towards the built and managed environments. This is what historian Robin Kelly refers to as freedom dreaming. And I believe this is crucial to our collective self-empowerment, to our individual self-empowerment, and at the core of rebuilding a world rooted in empathy and intersectional justice. So as a place to begin, let's rewind to the summer of 2020, a very difficult time in which academic discontent was brewing. If you recall, early that summer, letters written by architecture students and alumni concerning institutional racism began sprouting up across the United States and Canada. The student letters first began on June 1st, 2020 at Harvard Graduate School of Design, or the GSD. 5 days after the callous murder of George Floyd, 2 student organizations, the African American Student Union and Africa GSD, issued a public statement to the dean and senior leadership of the school. Titled Notes on Credibility, the document challenged the perennial absence of Black students and faculty during its 84 years as a professional school at the university, while making 13 demands towards anti-racist reforms. As notes on credibility suggest, the institution's history of racism was dependent on collective and consistent passivity, ambivalence, and complicity. This letter accrued over 814 signatures from students and alumni, and it wasn't alone. Other letters sprouted up in response to statements issued by university administrators as mounting racial unrest and public protests against anti-Black police brutality swept the collective consciousness on a global scale. 4 days later, Columbia GSAP's administration received a letter written by its alumni group for action. It was accompanied by 629 signatures at the time of submission. An internal letter from Syracuse University's architecture students and alumni with 162 signatures followed. A letter to the Board of Trustees and Administration at the Cooper Union was sent a day later, supported by 448 signatures. The cascade of letters continued to flow from all corners of the continent. In June, letters demanding reforms in architectural education were published at Virginia Tech, Yale University, University of British Columbia, University of Virginia, Texas Tech, University of Toronto, University of Pennsylvania, Rhode Island School of Design, and Rice University. By July, additional letters challenging the educational system sprouted up at 17 other schools. These too were accompanied by thousands more signatures. According to my crowdsourced calculations, by August, in the span of less than 12 weeks, over 6,800 current and former students representing at least 30 architecture schools across the United States and Canada had banded together to make their demands for change heard. Now, since then, numerous architecture schools on the continent have found themselves at a crossroads, hanging on by the fraying threads of diversity-light measures. In response to the similar demands issued by students and alumni of these institutions, many administrations have adopted changes involving the least amount of structural transformation and focused on slight shifts and procedural amendments instead. Their diversity, equity, and inclusion reforms have relied primarily on optical and substitutional logics, what Bailey Jackson and Rita Hardiman identify as symbolic change and identity change in their continuum of anti-racist organizational development. But let's face it, it's long been obvious that this discipline's narratives and practices have refrained from offering an accurate reflection of our social realities. Inequality is not the byproduct of natural law. Inequality is engineered. That the underrepresentation of BIPOC architects and designers remains a persistent and pernicious problem despite nearly 200 years of professional practice in the United States is a socially constructed and socially reinforced problem. Now, according to NCARB, the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, which facilitates the licensure and credentializing of architects in the United States, the number of licensed architects who identify as women of color as of 2019 cumulatively amounted to 0.55%, or 639 people in total out of 116,242 registered architects. Of course, this data is in itself incomplete, as NCARB's very depressing statistics are based on US Census categories in which people who identify as Arab and Latinx are often mischaracterized. Indigenous women were not even given a percentage in their tabulations. As an aside, it's significant to note that there's actually never been a rigorous and comprehensive study performed by social scientists on the issue of representation in architecture conducted using an intersectional framework that actually accounts for all stages of professional engagement, from entry into educational programs and the workforce to licensure and beyond. Such a study would prove crucial to really understanding the specific barriers to entry and access. Now, these metrics matter for a number of reasons. Beyond signaling a clear indication of bias at multiple levels, the absence of people of color in world-making disciplines has serious stakes. How our cities, towns, and infrastructure are built, the preservation of cultural heritage, knowledge, and public space, the representations that we see in the world, and the protection of natural resources are issues that require a diverse array of people to advocate for but also identify with the populations and places their work is intended to serve. So it was against this looming, overwhelming backdrop of nested problems and the shared awareness of the ineffectuality of institutions to responsibly respond to these issues that I started to meet on a frequent basis with various groups of BIPOC practitioners representing the spectrum of both scholarship and practice. Now, meanwhile, my inbox had become a receptacle for what seemed like a surge of panicked emails from college and graduate students of color, many whom I didn't actually know, seeking professional advice. Among the questions I received was the question of applying to PhD programs in art and architectural history, a process that, let's face it, can feel completely opaque and difficult to navigate, and even more difficult to imagine as a person of color, given our collective underrepresentation in the spheres of so-called higher education. Now, it was an experience that I wholeheartedly identified with. Across 4 institutions in the fields of art and architecture, I had only one professor that was a person of color in a span of nearly 20 years. As a first-generation college graduate of Korean immigrants by way of Bolivia and Korea, I had very few mentors who could relate to the complexities of pursuing a career in creative fields without access to generational wealth. There was absolutely no one I could ask. No one in my family or in my school could answer questions about navigating the art world or academia as a woman of color, never mind the practicalities of pursuing a creative path. It was maddening to observe that 20 years later, so little had changed. So as a practical measure, I corralled a group of BIPOC students and recent graduates who had reached out into a few group Zoom sessions about PhD programs, and then I opened this up to other BIPOC folks interested in the topic through social media. To my surprise, these early events were attended by enthusiastic students and emerging practitioners across 5 countries. In the sessions, I relayed everything I wish I had known. How to structure a clear proposal, how to find a great advisor, the financial realities of pursuing a doctorate as an international student with no college fund to fall back on, how to endure the marathon task of completing a doctorate while maintaining multiple jobs. I also spoke about how my decision to pursue a degree in architectural history as an artist was a political decision as much as it was an intellectual one. And my hope was that with more historians of color, the range of stories, interpretations, and vocabularies by which we talk about world building would cease to operate on these default settings and instead come alive with possibility. After all, the value of history is that it can arouse our own costly world-making habits, not only by describing shadows of hope and failure using a rear view mirror approach, but by refracting the ghosts of the past to project historical parallels into the present. As Audre Lorde put it, by ignoring the past, we're encouraged to repeat its mistakes. Now, all the while, the email requests for information continued to flow, especially after I made this post on social media. It was when a very disillusioned aspiring architect based in the United Arab Emirates requested to meet me online and had stayed up very patiently till the wee hours of the morning to talk, only to realize during our conversation that I am not a practicing architect and could not advise on matters of the profession, that I recognized there were likely dozens of other emerging BIPOC designers who had similar questions as she did. And so it was at this point that I realized that I had to call in the big guns, summon all the architects and practitioners that I had been in conversation with throughout the summer to participate in a form of mediated information exchange. So with the generous participation of a range of innovative creative practitioners, Office Hours quickly developed its contours and its framework iteratively through 20 weekly events in a span of 5 months. In its first year, it offered weekly sessions that featured a variety of speakers representing key areas and issues that attendees had expressed interest in learning about. The events were advertised each week on Instagram with a link to a registration. Each week, sessions filled up in a matter of hours with a waitlist. We explored topics such as applying to college programs, how to start an architecture firm, how to balance a career as an educator while maintaining a design practice, the politics of becoming a licensed architect as a person of color, how to work in community-oriented or civic design, how to become a creative director or a curator, what an urban designer does, how to get a book published. The format of office hours is streamlined to be simple, accessible, and straightforward. Our bi-monthly 75-minute session topics and speakers are advertised on Instagram, now twice a month. The first 200 BIPOC students and practitioners that sign up receive a link to the Zoom event. During our discussions, invited speakers tell the group about their professional journeys and offer advice and insights for the first 20 minutes. And then we partake in an interactive Q&A for the remainder of the 75-minute session, in which attendees can ask their questions to speakers directly. So it feels a little bit like a talk show. We're nearing the end of our second season now, with only 3 more sessions left. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that office hours emerged in response to a very specific problem and need, but one that connects to much larger questions about the imagination and power in its objective to disseminate and render visible and more accessible strategies of world-making by and for practitioners of color. For many attendees and speakers, this will be the first time in which they've been in a space of 100 plus BIPOC designers within the context of architecture and design. It's often a very emotional experience. In an effort to decenter whiteness, each session is strictly intended as a discursive platform by and for BIPOC practitioners to share experiences and strategies with a sense of trust, support, and communion. The project, in this sense, is predicated on what Paulo Freire has referred to as a dialogical model of education. That is, an experience that's co-created by subjects, held in relation by a sense of mutual respect and a shared struggle for liberation, rather than what Freire describes as a banking model of education. That is a schoolmaster dynamic rooted in the top-down delivery of information as a form of salvation, or in more recent times, as an extractive service. I'm sometimes approached by people interested in mentorship or acting as a mentor who talk about office hours on these terms. And I'm quick to point out that the traditional mentorship dynamics that we're familiar with can often replicate the structural and racialized inequalities of society, especially when involving people who represent the norms and practices of hegemonic power. To presume that the strategies by which white men and women have navigated the discipline are applicable to everyone else is to overrepresent oneself and to reinforce one of the biggest fallacies upon which racism is predicated. After all, the educational and achievement gap is not due to a lack of hard work or acumen amongst people of color. The educational system and professions are themselves designed to relegate specific groups of people to the margins by using concepts like hard work and scarcity as alibis for exclusion. Freire's banking model is akin to the dangerous minds model of mentorship and education rooted in oppressive, patronizing, and reductive frames of reference that position help as benevolence, charity, or saviorism, and that render the recipients of such help as passive, disenfranchised, and victimized objects in the position to receive. So unlike traditional mentorship structures and the current market of self-help based on individualistic entrepreneurialism, office hours does not aspire to relay to its attendees how to get ahead or how to play by the rules or a way to accrue cheat codes for success. Instead, as an artistic and political project rooted in intersectional justice, the initiative has sought to increase the representation of practitioners whose own layered identities intersect across categorizations of race, ethnicity, class, gender identification, sexuality, disability, age, and immigration status. Speakers are encouraged to engage in open discussions about the ways that their overlapping social identities have shaped their professional experiences and insights. Speakers are also encouraged to offer divergent perspectives on similar topics. So importantly, office hours seeks to feature approaches to world-making that champion responsibility and respect towards others and the built and managed environments. That is not ways of excelling and profiting from the unequal systems in which our societies are built, but rather strategies to change them. The goal of each session is to offer information freely with the goal of empowerment by sharing methodologies for design practice or tools to navigate particular moments of transition in one's life in more equitable ways. We hope to ultimately encourage agency and self-determination. Now, dialogue can be a space of domination as much as it can be a vehicle for liberation. Jürgen Habermas famously observed that speech is made impossible by the presence of power differentials. Office hours, house rules, and community agreements are its foundations and its non-negotiables. As a whole, the project foregrounds real-time interaction. All attendees are asked to turn their cameras on for our events, technology and accessibility permitting, and arrive accountable to the group dynamic. Appearing on screen is a crucial act of reciprocity that ensures the integrity of the social initiative that it's reaching the people it's intended for, and also mitigates the propensity for extractive engagement, this sort of touristic fly in and fly out method of engaging with information. It also allows participants to form a sense of trust and vulnerability with its speakers. Sessions are recorded for our archives, but not posted publicly, as topics can often touch on sometimes personal and painful experiences. Now, you might be asking, but how do these events actually produce change in architecture and in the world? The system is rigged. While I can't provide an algorithm or an easy answer for social change, I can say that given the unexpected global reach of office hours and its uncanny ability to have magnetized literally thousands of people across the world in a year and a half to abide by its community agreements, pretty much the last thing I expected, I have accrued a few observations that I'd like to share. And I share these with you with the hope that, that as I find myself within the contours of this still nascent ongoing experiment, that it might inform your own construction of new models for social change. Now, my first observation deals with the project's deliberate status outside of institutionally channeled and bureaucratically sanctioned systems. In their book, The Undercommons, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney suggest that those working in the underbelly of institutions should annex new models of sociability and experiment with them to develop new methods of relating. Such modes of sociability could be prime opportunities to explore what Fred Moten eloquently has described in another talk: difference without hierarchy and without separation. While it may seem as though the only way to operate in the world is through the infrastructures of large organizations, identifying existing resources and actually working with social groups that you find yourselves in can challenge you to privilege resourcefulness over resources, and also uncover creative sources of support right in front of your eyes. Now, the limitations of a smaller budget also offers the inverse in creative liberty. So beyond the cost of a $15 a month Zoom account, Adobe software that I already owned, a computer that I already owned, a free Instagram account, and a free Eventbrite account, and my own labor, the project relied on the generosity of speakers that were linked by shared values, none of whom I had to work to convince to participate for free. Their own self-identification with the attendees of these events was tacit, and a shared sense of values motivated them to pay it forward. So after 2 months, I approached the Architectural League of New York, a recognized nonprofit, to act as a fiscal sponsor. And this allowed for donations to office hours to be tax deductible. These donations that we've received have since enabled all of the speakers to be compensated for the time and effort. Now, secondly, what are we to think about the large numbers of attendees who have participated in office hours sessions from all over the world? Last year, I came across the work of the late environmental scientist and systems analyst Donella Meadows, whose essay, Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in a System, made a lasting impression. Leverage points are like acupressure points, or places in a complex system, such as a corporation, a city, an ecosystem, or an economic system that can produce big changes. In attending to the world's most pressing problems, Meadows notes that experts tend to fixate on the wrong areas for the answers, and more often than not, they find themselves pushing in the wrong direction because they have no idea how these complex systems actually behave. The key is to understand the behavior of these systems and then to identify leverage points, which is a tricky proposition because their location can often be counterintuitive. So as part of her 12-point theory of places to intervene in a system, this PDF you can download for free on the internet. Meadows identifies that one of the most effective places to intervene is in the realm of what she refers to as the shared idea in the minds of society, the great big unstated assumptions. Unstated because unnecessary to state. Everyone already knows them. And these assumptions constitute that society's paradigm, or the deepest set of beliefs about how the world works. She argues that to enact systemic change, we need to focus on shifting the middle's shared idea about an issue rather than focusing on extremes. Now, what the student letters that I gave an overview of at the beginning of this talk that emerged that summer indicated to me was the coexistence of two paradigms in our field. One still antiquated and yet very active, and the other emergent. Paradigms are the sources of systems, Meadows writes. From them, from shared social agreements about the nature of reality, come system goals and information flows, feedbacks, stocks, and flows about everything else about systems. So how do you change paradigms? In a nutshell, you keep pointing at the anomalies and failures in the old paradigm. You keep speaking louder and with assurance from the new one. You insert people with the new paradigm in places of public visibility and power. You don't waste time with reactionaries. Rather, you work with active change agents and with the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. Now, I consider the speakers and the attendees of office hours sessions as both change agents and this vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. Those who take part in office hours are curious and interested in partaking in the sharing of an alternative set of values than what we've been taught before. And this is where I've come to observe the political potential of active listening as both a powerful tool for anti-racist practice and the production of aesthetic beauty. To listen alongside others and give space to acknowledge the experience of another who may or may not look like you, but who has been underserved by nested and complex layers of injustice, just like you. This is the basis from which a profound realization springs forth, that one's own uplifting is intrinsically connected to the liberation of others. As well, the insights from office hours attendees contained in their questions and comments often build the most insightful parallels between issues such as the lack of generational wealth in Black communities and immigrant communities without flattening distinctions. These insights draw from lived experience alongside other forms of knowledge that have not been given space in the culture of architecture and design. And in this way, office hours group format often has allowed us to practice the values of multiracial and multi-ethnic solidarity, empathy, and generosity, rather than the tenets of singularity, extraction, and competition as impactful social tools for living and working together with a shared sense of responsibility. Now, creating demands for reform are important and necessary, but this often leaves the onus for change on those most unwilling and, frankly, the most unincentivized to do so. Our task is to move beyond pointing out the insufficiencies of the systems that we find ourselves in, however important, and to analyze and reflect on how the systems of architecture culture are designed, to figure out how they can be redesigned. I always come back to a series of questions posed by the historian of science and philosopher Donna Haraway in her explanation of the principles she uses when looking at the production of modern culture. Haraway put it best in this video, which I encourage you to take a look at online, when she said, quote, "It seems to me that the cultural critic is faced by a world that looks very much like tangled balls of yarn. One way to approach the situation is to pull on a thread and begin to untangle the ball of meanings and begin to trace through the one thread, then another. What gets to count as nature? For whom and when? And how much does it cost to produce nature at a particular moment in history for a particular group of people? What gets to count as nature for whom and when? How much it costs to produce nature at a particular moment in history for a particular group of people?" We could take this line of thought and substitute the culture of architecture for nature. How might we take the culture of architecture apart its stories, its institutions, its protocols, its economic thresholds, its labor practices, and considers who designs this system, who maintains this system, and why. Office Hours has sought to approach this question by considering how architecture and design as world-making disciplines are inherently social practices at their core. They're industries and disciplines and institutions that are created out of social consensus. They rely on unspoken community agreements and unspoken values that have determined who has been allowed to participate in the molding of the discipline and of the world at different moments in time, for different prices, and for different people's benefit. Now, I mentioned earlier that the integrity and intentions of a model or a discipline seem to radiate outwards to determine its effects. And although it's still a nascent enterprise operating at a very humble scale of production, and I don't want to overstate the potential of what office hours can do, one of my hypotheses driving this laboratory for social engagement is that recalibrating the terms, the values, the social dynamics by which the sharing and redistribution of knowledge takes place, this is actually merely only one thread in our field that can lead to untangling much larger meanings and generating much larger effects. For instance, office hours is actually steeped in the tradition of oral storytelling, common amongst BIPOC communities, and operates according to a maxim based in disability and BIPOC empowerment. Nothing about us without us. The project assumes the position that an equitable ecosystem of cultural practice begins with us by collectively reimagining and recalibrating our relational and intersubjective engagements as part of the praxis of being human. This is not to be confused with the project of European heteronormative monohumanism, which Sylvia Wynter claims overpresents itself as if it were the human itself, and that produces a kind of flatness to mask the beautiful gradients of lived experience and rendering us, some of us, less than human. Rather, I wish to extend Sylvia Wynter's prompt to consider being human as a verb rather than a noun, as a maneuver that recognizes white supremacy and other axes of domination as founded upon pathologies of hierarchy, aggression, and singularity as forms of inhumanity. So to reconceptualize being human as a praxis is a call for rewriting the meanings and capacities of being human as decolonial subjects. In my view, the project of reconceptualizing the praxis of being human is rooted in our capacity for endlessly creating ourselves and in our capacity for growth through consciousness, intersubjectivity, and nonviolence. This is not an academic exercise. It's actually an active practice rooted in action. The project of reinscribing ourselves through mutuality recognizes our individual capacities to cause harm and our individual reflexes to foreground our self-interest before the interests of the collective. For this reason, I continually return to a quote by the incredible filmmaker and diversity mediator, Lee Man-hwa: "The secret to changing the world is a mirror and a dream of a better world." Now, in considering new vocabularies for mutuality, we might actually think of old models produced by our ancestors. For instance, let's consider the give and take of each social interaction as one part of an intersubjective network of commitments. When the French sociologist Marcel Mauss very famously studied the potlatch systems of First Nations communities in the Pacific Northwest, the gift economies of Polynesia, the ancient legal systems in Roman, Germanic, and Indo-European societies, and the theory of the gift in classical Hindu law, in each instance, he observed that to give and receive something without the prospect of return was not the same as walking away from an unpaid tab. Instead, Mauss noted a system of checks and balances between the recipient and the giver in each society. This loop of exchanges, what he referred to as a catalog of transfers between members, contributed to how society was defined, not the individualism of social life today. As Mauss put it, this is what is wrong with the free gift. A gift that does nothing to enhance solidarity is a contradiction. Now, the American anthropologist Marshall Sahlins has offered another model of relationality, which he refers to as a mutuality of being. This model of intersubjectivity is different than how we think of community today. It's not merely a recognition of oneself in another through a shared goal. Rather, shared mutuality occurs when one recognizes and participates in another's intentions and approaches. Importantly, this connection does not stem from self-interest. It also takes place when the interests of another differ from one's own. For example, for the New Guineans of the Nebular Valley, kinship is formed by sexual reproduction and social engagement through the transmission of kopong, grease, or fat, what is referred to as the essential matter of living organisms, whose ultimate source is the soil. Kopong is a substance that's transmitted in a mother's milk or a father's semen, thus tethering offspring to parents in a manner that's closer to bloodlines and genetic heredity. Yet this grease is also found in sweet potatoes and pork. So kinship links can be formed by sharing food, eating together, and eating from the same land. For this reason, the children of immigrants can be considered kinfolk, just as the offspring of two brothers are as much related because they were sustained by the same soil because their fathers issue from the same parents. Now, what would it mean for world building practices to position the textures of lived experience as the basis of kinship, to root architecture culture in a sense of vulnerability, intersubjectivity, a mutuality of being? How might doing so in shared struggle enable us to work towards the advancement on behalf of another outside of our immediate concerns, to repair the stratified and unequal terrain of our professional lives and our world? If we place as much investment and innovation in our social reality as we pour into transforming our material reality, to quote Ruha Benjamin again, what would such radical acts render possible? Now, the art historian Grant Kester notes that dialogical practices are often rooted in forms of insight that are produced through processes of social interaction and intersubjective exchange that are grounded in the context of shared resistance. Important forms of knowledge are produced through dialogical practice about our capacities as social and political agents, about our ability to imagine the world differently, and about the values that structure our interrelationship with others. In his words, dialogical practices open up a space of possibility that had not yet been thinkable before. Now, operating as an artist to launch a project like this, that is choosing architecture as a disciplinary site for intervention and institutional critique, has offered me the conceptual freedom to rethink platforms like Zoom or Instagram as a kind of technological substrate or material with which to build a space of recoded intersubjective and mutual engagement, and also position the future as a space of possibility. But the point is what you do doesn't have to operate like the ways you've been taught to operate. I'd encourage you to read Lucy Lepard's essay on Trojan horses. You can experiment too. Office hours is an iterative process. And the point of us and the point of this project is that none of us are infallible. But the creation of new spaces and new infrastructures to imagine alternative forms of world building based on intersubjective exchange rather than fantasies of domination have yet to happen alongside the reform of these crumbling and archaic institutional structures. Educational expert Bettina Love writes that abolitionist teaching starts with freedom dreaming, dreams grounded in a critique of injustice. These dreams are not whimsical, unattainable daydreams. They're critical and imaginative dreams of collective resistance. Likewise, for the historian Robin Kelly, freedom dreams are a requirement for liberation. He writes, any revolution must begin with thought, with how we imagine a new world, with how we reconstruct our social and individual relationships, with unleashing our desire and unfolding a new future on the basis of love and creativity rather than rationality. Now, what would happen if we could collectively imagine and collaboratively build the world differently according to values rooted in emancipation, accountability, nonviolence, and interdependence? we have yet to see this, but this is what I hope this project can eventually start to generate as theorizable objects of study. Thank you for your attention.
Sorry, struggling to unmute. Thank you so much, Esther. That was incredible. And just really insightful to hear you speak about not just the evolution of and the creation of office hours, but also all of those ideas and quotes and incredible texts that kind of, I guess, build a world around it, and talk about the importance of world building and actually talk about our agency as architects and designers to kind of hope for a better future and a more inclusive future. It's also interesting. It was really interesting for me because actually that moment in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests was the same kind of moment that this series, New Models, was born out of. And it came, I think what's interesting is it came from that feeling of helplessness and frustration that change is so slow, and an attempt to try and create a space for conversation. And I mean, personally, I found just listening to people present their new models really inspiring. But I think in your case, what I really enjoyed is how you created something outside of an institution, because I guess new models are still within an institution. And I enjoyed hearing you speak as well about, how it started on, just as a form of exchange and, paying it forward, and then how it grew to actually get like fiscal support. And I'm just curious, I guess, maybe to start the Q&A, and also to remind everyone to please also ask questions and, either post them in the chat.
I don't think people can write publicly in the chat. I've been receiving some very beautiful responses, but privately. So
okay, I can change that. Thanks, Shumi. So please post your questions in the chat or raise your hand. We'd love to hear you ask a question. But I guess maybe to start things off while people are thinking of their questions, I guess I was curious about the title office hours, because it's a kind of format that comes out of academia. But I think especially both people while they're studying, but I would say even myself I haven't been a student for a long time, but I kind of miss the sense of getting advice, or I think what Shumi posted in the chat, feeling this lack of representation, especially when, I guess, being worried about my career path or where everything is going, and wanting to speak to people who've maybe faced similar challenges. And I think that blurring of formats between academia and practice is really interesting. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that were, and how to create a space that kind of brings those two worlds together, because it feels like they're getting more and more kind of separated as we kind of evolve in architectural practice.
Thanks for your question. And also thanks for the opportunity to talk about office hours in this way. I don't usually get an opportunity to actually talk about all of the things that sort of informed its, emergence, I guess. The name office hours came from Dongpeng Wang. I'm terrible at names and titles, and I just felt this overwhelming sense of urgency to just put people in a Zoom room. And I know that this is the power of design and aesthetics, that if you can put a graphic to something, that it immediately kind of has a form to it, even if it is sort of, a kind of immaterial thing that you're trying to construct. And I was talking to Dong, and Dong had a radio show where he had called it office hours. And, it hadn't really been active for a while, but he just said, just use it. Because I said, my name's so good. I need something like that. He's just use it. And so literally the graphic was even lifted from Dong for for the first while. And he was very generous in offering that. But this is to say, the name, it seems institutional in some ways, because office hours, you tend to think of that as a kind of I literally have office hours as an educator now. But I guess the point of it was that all of these people I was having conversations with in the summer, many of our educators, I mean, Shumi, or that you can chime in on this, but we all do this. We all get people we don't even know. I'm sure you manage to have people, asking you for advice all the time. And part of it is that you want to be helpful and to be responsible and offer professional advice, being a little bit older than others in the field, but also, being aware of your visibility as a person of color. There aren't a lot of people that look like us that have accrued a certain amount of experience that are willing to share that, I think. And relative to the kind of scale of the field. So yeah, that's sort of like, so the name was a bit of a, it was in some ways like kind of a more of a reference to the fact that it was formalizing a kind of activity that people were doing anyways. And, there's so much labor in some ways, so much labor and outreach and energy that doesn't really get accounted for oftentimes in works of solidarity. So this was just a way to kind of formalize it in some way. But yeah, in terms of like, what was, that was such a tough summer. And in fact, like I was sort of seizing up a little bit, right? Thinking back to that moment.
I'm just feeling by Esther, and it was such a tough summer. I feel like for all of us, certainly sitting here in the UK, in some ways was very, very different to being in America, as you guys were kind of experiencing. Just heat on another level. But at the same time, I appreciated those conversations so much because the conversation here was so stunted and so kind of pale in comparison, and so kind of, let's say, apologetic. It still is. And so the sort of rawness of those conversations before you kicked off with office hours, when it was just like groups of people going, what do we do with all of this? And then the speed with which you and Dong kind of were talking about this, and then you turned it into office hours, it was so, so appreciated. But to anyone listening, it takes a huge toll. and to recognize yourself in others and therefore to want to help them is an amazing thing that Esther has done, but it's a huge amount of energy and emotional labor and just capacity, just like human capacity, that is worth noting. If you guys are thinking about, being this person at some point in your lives, it's worth noting that like the kind of mutual support system that Esther's talking about and building through office hours, it's really necessary to sustain that too. I was buying time for other people asking questions and saying things.
I've got a question in the chat, but it's still been sent only to me, even though I think I've changed the settings. So I'll just maybe ask it on their behalf. I think Alanis has a question asking if there's any advice for people who want to teach outside of gate-kept institutions. For example, if you don't have the postgraduate credentials to teach yet, but you don't want to wait or let it depend on that, or like, I guess, what you want to teach and share independently on alternative platforms. Do you have any advice for that?
I don't know. It's I guess I guess I have questions about what you want to teach, and if it's teaching or if it's more like peer-to-peer sharing of skills. Like I know that there are people have messaged the office hours account, like current students wanting to do things like that, like teaching software even. And I just don't think I just think that there's like an expectation. I don't know, maybe I was from like playing in like, maybe I grew up at a time where like DIY was like, I'm 100 years old, but there was, a time in DIY was like you just did it, right? Like you didn't have to wait for permission or figure out the perfect formula. You just kind of did it. You made a fanzine, you started a band, you did what you just created the thing that you wanted to see in the world. And it doesn't have to be the super slick commercial perfect thing that you iterate over time, And I would say like, without knowing the specifics of, your particular, desire to teach or engage with others in this way, you might have the desire, but I think you need to find the audience. Like you need to find the need for it. And it starts with there. It starts really, really small. So for me, it was like, emails from people. It's also classic that people want to start a PhD program in a moment of like recession or like some kind of historical crisis, because you're going to be tied up in an institution for at least like 100 years, right? Producing that document. At least if you're doing a PhD in North America, it's like, oh, well, there's 8 years of like security in some capacity where I have something like healthcare or something for, a little while. not to put down anyone that wants to do a PhD. I did one, whatever. But my point is that, psychologically, it's like, this is a thing, it happens. But it just started with a need of like people emailing me, wanting to know, like having really specific questions, right? And it just starts there. And I think in that sense, like what's funny is that I've just met a lot of people that they feel like it has to be this perfect large infrastructure at first. And I'm like, no. Like you take like mouse steps. You might have like eagle vision, but you have mouse steps to get there, right? And you keep kind of toggling between eagle vision, like kind of your big aspirations, but it can only be realized through, like the fog clears in front of you every few steps, right? So, and then you iterate. So I guess, I don't know, that's a really unclear response to your question in some ways, but I think just finding out, like, maybe just defining who your audience would be and like what skills you'd want to share. And that is like a place to begin. I hope that helps.
Alanis, I've unmuted you if you want to elaborate.
Yep, that helps for sure. I feel like similar to you, I really did participate in a lot of DIY culture before, but for some reason in the recent years, or especially the effect of the pandemic to me was the opposite of what maybe happened to other people, where sharing became more open to everyone. For me, I pretty much got overwhelmed by all of everything is online and everything is just happening online. So I kind of stepped back and I'm just learning how to like be active online again, because that's really the only place to be right now. But it's super helpful you talking about DIY culture, because that's really where you start.
Yeah, but you just start with like, what would you want to teach? Do you have like something specific that you would want to engage with, or certain people that already are interested in learning something that you know about?
I actually don't have a specific thing in mind yet. Like when I was a college student, an organization asked me to teach whatever class I wanted, and then I actually didn't know. So I kind of just figure out what I want to teach when there's already like an opportunity to teach. And actually I learned that teaching actually teaches, you learn so much from teaching, because you have to organize what you know, and then you don't realize you already know these things until you actually put them together to explain to other people.
So you want to teach to find out what you already know? I love this. No, I think it's great. And it's true. You do learn a lot by teaching.
Definitely. I mean, honestly, like just use the things that you have in front of you, and use the circles of people, the social circles you're already in communion with, right? Like that's a lot. It's like a lot more than, it's not. And then, and that's the thing about social media is like, I have a lot of problems with social media, but, if there's ways that you can retool the better things, the better aspects of these technological tools that we have, right? And retool them in ways that can recode sort of the way in which they engage socially, or the way that they work for you in some ways. Like that's all a medium in a way that you can use, right? So, I don't know. I don't know, if you're whatever you wanted to, do you want to, hey, everyone, do you want to learn how to make a pie with me? Like whatever it might be, right? Like who knows who's going to respond?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what's quite interesting also about, maybe as a silver lining to an otherwise terrible situation over the last year and a half, is that suddenly the internet kind of enabled people to connect across kind of geographies and through weird platforms like this. And I really liked how you talked about kind of social media and Zoom and things like that, like being a substrate for this to kind of take seed or take hold. And I think you used it in a really effective way, because often these platforms can be quite divisive or exclusive. And I think a lot of it is, as you were saying, thinking about who designed the system and who maintains it. And even these platforms can be understood as part of that, but then how do we appropriate them or manipulate them or change them in some way? I guess it's a kind of ongoing challenge, but maybe could you speak more, Esther, on how, what you've learned from the things that you've done on these platforms and what's worked and maybe what hasn't?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Someone made a comment recently. This is sort of a roundabout way of answering your question, like I have been so far. But someone made a comment recently about how office hours, because Zoom, when you're in gallery view, renders everyone's sort of faces and presence the same size, and this is an issue of design, right? That has a kind of equalizing effect, because I had said, I can't remember. I was talking to an office hour, like someone who attended a bunch of office hour sessions. And they had said, I said, like, I'm always surprised by how people like feel, even if they're very introverted, feel like they can ask a question. And I love that. Like that to me is a sign it's working, in the same way that in a classroom, like the most introverted person, if they feel like they have something to contribute, that they feel comfortable, engaging, that's such a good sign of a healthy dynamic. And they pointed out that it's because the boxes render everyone sort of an equal size, that you don't feel like the speaker is, on some other, other level, the way that you might if someone was on a podium or something. And so I just bring that up because I think that, I'm interested, like I'm trained in photography before coming to architectural history. And I really think about Zoom as a kind of image making medium. It's like real-time image making in a way, right? Like a kind of composite portrait of whether it's like 100 people participating or 5. And of course it gets more complicated than just what you see, but those aspects of it I find really interesting, actually. And also like, yeah, I don't know. I just find that really, really interesting. And so I guess like what I find interesting about Zoom, I mean, as fatiguing as it is, and the kind of Zoom lecture fatigue that we all probably felt midway through last year, especially, is that like these tools can be, we can design these tools, that the tools affect the way that we socially engage. And I know that seems like an obvious point in some ways, but I think people tend to think about technology almost like natural law, like these things are just like arrive to us, and then, but without thinking that we can, engage with them further and refine them in some ways. And that they really change the way that we think and the way that we perceive and the way that we relate. So on that level, I tried to make Zoom the least annoying, being on Zoom for office hours events, like the least annoying as possible. Like, I know people have like a limited attention span. I've tried to create a format for office hours that seems engaging, but it's always iterated, right? Like we learn from what we do, and it can be improved, et cetera. But also the people that attend, it's not like it is in some ways a static formula or a template, but because everyone that attends every 2 weeks it's like a different chemistry of people based on the speaker, based on a different demographic, even like it's constantly in flux. And so it's very alchemical, like the way that people will engage, the kinds of questions, people who feels comfortable, et cetera. There's always new people from like all over the world joining. And then what's also really incredible is the way that people will use things like the Zoom or the chat function to have connections amongst themselves and then make new friends, like literally all over the world. I mean, it's a really it sounds really utopian, but it kind of is. Like we've been so lucky that people have been so nice, we haven't had, we just knock on wood, but we haven't had like huge issues around having to sort of police people in some way in terms of their behavior, and I hate that verb, but so anyways, that isn't really, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I just think that if there's sometimes rethinking, trying to strip associations away from certain very common things we have in front of us, gives us a new way of thinking of them as like material kind of, or mediums, or, different kinds of materials to work with. And unfortunately, architects are trained in a way that is like so sort of narrow in some ways with like what the expectations are. And I went to art school, so I'm like, for me, like a urinal is a precedent, right? That can be art. So I'm not burdened in the same way, given that I have the urinal to think about. Like I'm not, burdened in that same way, because I come from a slightly different field. But I'm always trying to encourage people to like, especially students of mine, to, read like Lucy Lepard, read about Trojan horses, that the most innovative kind of advancements in some ways of how people are pushing a field or a discipline often come by just like kind of letting go of a lot of the burdens of the protocols of like how you do things. So, yeah.
There's quite a few questions now in the chat, and I see one raised hand. So I'll just go through them in order, and some people like can't unmute just because they have like noise in the background. So I'll try and summarize the first question, which was really about I guess what you touched on at the beginning of the talk, trying to find data on I guess like diversity in the profession. And Leanne was saying that like the lack of diversity actually brought her to seek out think tanks and movements that kind of affect change. But she was wondering how to share more information to students, to provide additional mentorship. And also, do you have opportunities to kind of like, I guess, to utilize a resource for those that wish to promote and volunteer time to mentor people who are like looking to get licensed? So like, I guess, maybe it's about spreading the word, and also like at a professional level. And I think what's interesting maybe about office hours as well is that I think different sessions are also pitched to people at different levels and different times in their career. It's not, although it like is a lot for like emerging practitioners and students. I think I went to a session, I think that the first one that Shumi encouraged me to go to was actually for people that were like thinking about leadership roles and why there aren't enough people of color in leadership positions. So I don't know, Esther, if you want to take a stab at that. It's a longer question.
Yeah, I'm trying to come through the question. Okay, so could you discuss how to share more information to students to provide additional mentorship?
I mean, just to chime in here, the first session I went to was a session about getting licensure, particularly, well, it was presented about Black mentorship and the challenges faced by people of color in terms of, those things that you have to do to get licensure and how difficult it is to find mentorship. So there were certainly particular office hours sessions that were about that. No?
Yeah, we've also had Tammy Eaglebull, who's the first Indigenous woman to be licensed in North America, give a session on licensure and the kind of political aspects of it. I guess in terms of Leanne's question about how to share more information to students to provide additional mentorship, usually, you can go through, I don't want to, we've been talking about sort of working outside of institutions, but usually institutions are the best if people are actually students. So, funneling information through educators and asking them to disseminate it is one way of actually reaching students specifically. And then on a professional level, do you have a share opportunity to utilize as a resource for those that wish to promote and volunteer time? I don't know if I totally understand the question. Is this a question around can other mentors participate in office hours? Is that the question? Is that right? I hope I'm answering that correctly. If that is the question, I don't facilitate one-on-one mentorship opportunities. It takes a huge amount of resources and time to also vet people to be able to engage in those kinds of relationships. And, as I discussed, mentorship is rife with problems, right? It can often really replicate the kind of structural damage that we are already experiencing in the profession. So I don't have the resources to be able to, and office hours doesn't have the resources to be able to set up those kinds of relationships. And this is actually why, in some ways, the group mentoring format of office hours was it solved several problems, which is that, the reason why I convene people in a Zoom room, for example, to talk about PhD programs as the first office hour session, which didn't, it's just that I couldn't feasibly have 2-hour conversations with 20 people, right? But on top of that, though, I think it actually sends a more important message to be in communion with others. Because so much of what we talk about isn't just information delivery. It's not that banking model of education. We talk a lot about lived experience. And it's really important for me to provide a situation where people of color are talking to other people of color. That's for me, a non-negotiable. I get a lot of messages from organizations or individuals who are white that want to participate in office hours. And I'm just emphatically not that's just not what this project's about. So yeah. So yeah, I know that sounds really hardline, but it's like, I just think there has never been, we just haven't had a space like this before. And it's incredibly important for me, as well as for a lot of people in terms of the feedback I've received, that I'm very like mama bear about protecting that. And, you know, and to be frank, you know, I've received a lot, I'll be honest, like, you know, being an online kind of program in some ways without a ton of institutional support, I don't have any institutional support. You know, it's like, there are a lot of people giving a lot of messages, people giving a hard time at times, like around that, or feeling very entitled to be able to attend. And, you know, it's just really important that what I tend to say is the entire profession, if you're white, looks like you. I would just love to have 75 minutes every 2 weeks. You know what I mean? Like, can you just give us 75 minutes? So, yeah. So I'm sorry I don't have like more like a more formalized, maybe more professional answer in some ways, but you know, there are initiatives of mentorship being set up, but my response is always like, how do you vet who a mentor is? How do you vet the kind of information that, because at the end of the day, someone has to be accountable for that. And at least with office hours, like if I, you know, invited someone who was, let's say, incredibly irresponsible and destructive as a human being, that I would be held accountable, you know? And I think that's important, that I need to be, like, everyone needs to be accountable in some capacity. And oftentimes with mentorship, like I've had terrible mentors, like terrible mentors who give me terrible advice as a young person. I've even I cringe to even use the word mentor. People who told me to drop out of school, like people who told me like all kinds of things, you know, and which is crazy. So, you know, that's not like, so this is to say, I'm not trying to suggest, Leanne, that you're that type of person, but it's just really hard to be able to, from an organizational standpoint, at least with the scale of resources that we have, like be able to manage, like, you know, how to vet like the kind of, you know, engagement. So yeah, sorry if I sound like a little angry, I went off topic, but it's like, I get a lot of like, it's a hard space. This has been a sort of an interesting and difficult space to occupy, if I'm honest, that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think like that point about accountability is so important. Like a lot of people, like to become an educator, there maybe isn't enough of a vetting process. And like, especially in schools, I think where you're making these like formative decisions about your career path and what you might do. And I think all of us have probably been exposed to educators that have given us terrible advice or haven't been as encouraging as they should be. And I think like the most basic skill to become an educator should be to like, you know, encourage people and find opportunities and possibilities, but that's definitely not always the case. And I think that kind of sense of accountability should come first, rather than like, you know, I think what Alanis was saying at the beginning, like about having a qualification to teach. Like, I think accountability should maybe be more important. But I guess that the next question that's in the chat is about, are we actually seeing a change in the industry? And I think like the observation was about how in academia, the discourse is more prevalent, but has there really been a shift outside of that, like beyond talking about it? And I think you were talking about action in your talk. And so like, do you think that there've been significant changes? And I think the second part of that question is also about the shift from maybe being online to in real life. And I think, you know, I think this, like I said in the introduction, and I think a lot of people on this call have said in the chat and talked about, like, office hours created a really great space of community when we all felt isolated, and, you know, especially being able to connect to people online was really amazing. But then how to translate that into physical reality, I guess, is maybe difficult. And I guess the comment says people seem to be more focused on themselves and their own practice instead of being more inclusive. And so, like, what do you think about this struggle kind of post lockdowns and isolation?
Really good questions. Do we see a change in industry? I would like to think so, but, you know, George Kubler, not to, you know, I always go back to George Kubler. He has this like metaphor of being within the contours of a historical moment. You can't tell what's happening because you're within the contours of it. And I would say we are in the contours of what I would like to think is a turning point on multiple levels. Like the fact even that, like, Manager, that you've curated a lecture series on this topic, like this never would have happened 50 years ago, 20 years ago, right? Like we wouldn't even be here, right? Like, so we wouldn't even be talking about this. So on some levels, the change can be very difficult sometimes to identify when you're within the contours of that contemporary moment. I will say, though, that I get a lot of messages from people that have attended office hours that have decided to make changes in their lives. The changes can be everything from I decided to, as a college dropout, to go back to school, or it can be and to become licensed, right? And or it can be I've decided to get together with a few of my friends, and after attending a few office hour sessions, start up our own practice, which is incredible, right? Like, and this is the thing about office hours is my hope is that, giving people tools and ideas around ethical forms of world building and world making, that everyone in office hours, like I always say this to people, like, can you imagine if like 100 people in office hours went off and like did their own thing and had practices that didn't exploit their employees or interns, or, like actually engaged, like built the world with care, like, understood the responsibility to repair the world. Like that's not a small thing, right? That's my hope. But, it comes down to individual agency, and it's hard. It's not easy work. It's like we're in that awkward stage of like the leverage points kind of article, suggests that we're sort of, I think, in the middle of two paradigms, and we see them clashing continually. Like the student letters were like a very clear indication that there's a vast middle ground of people that actually probably I could reach out to. I didn't think it would be at the scale of office hours, but that, I was meeting with the vast middle ground of people that are very open-minded and reasonable in these conversations throughout the summer, other educators like myself, et cetera, meeting lots of new people as well that I hadn't met before in the field that also felt the same way. So I do think that things are changing, but I think that always the problem is that we expect for these changes to be outside of ourselves and initiated by someone else. And it's sort of delivered to us like DoorDash or something, or whatever you use in the UK, like Seamless or something, right? It shows up as like the perfect meal, and it won't be, right? It's like it's iterated and it won't be. But there have been new publications emerging. There have been new educational institutions emerging, like public programs, lecture series, like all these things that are emerging that for me are signs that things are changing. And I think it's also different too, because we're of a generation now where, most, like, there are more slowly, incrementally, there are more people of color entering the field. And now you find people in their 30s and 40s who are people of color actually in positions, slowly getting positions of decision-making power. And so I think that's, and I don't think it's just that you're a person of color and therefore your politics are, necessarily in alignment with mine or anyone else's, but I think that's how change happens, right? So this is to say, people will always be focused on themselves. Again, digital tools render that mindset. They reinforce that mindset, like things like Instagram, like Facebook. It's like literally designed to make you competitive with others and compare yourself with others. So I think digital and technological literacy is super important, and also rethinking the kind of tools and the kinds of conversations you want to surround yourself with. Like that's also important in terms of building a kind of worldview and a community and a tribe of people that can support you and sustain you. But I have to believe things are changing. Actually, Samaya Valley kind of grilled it in me. I asked her the same question and she was like, of course. So I was like, okay, you're right. Yeah, sorry. And then there was another question around, is there another question you had mentioned?
There is another question, but I think it's because we're running short of time, I think Dalia's question is a really good last question. So maybe we'll go to Mauricio, who had his hand raised to ask a question.
Yeah, hi. It's actually quite good timing because you were talking about individual agency, and I wanted to ask about sort of the other end of the spectrum to what Alanis was talking before, because I don't feel like I have much to teach anyone. So like I can't even lure my peers to come and I'll teach them to make a lemon pie because I don't know how to make a lemon pie. But I'm still like invested in creating that sense of community, especially with like peers that I can see that are much less willing to like reach out to have that resonance with other people of color. So I don't know if you have any advice as to how I can, generate that space.
Well, I guess I would flip the question and ask, what do you want to learn how to do? Do you want to learn how to make that lemon pie? Right? Like, it's not about like, I think teaching is about learning as much as it is about, it's not about mastery. It's not about domination. You know what I mean? Like, it's about learning and how to build things together. Right. And at least in my view, like that's the best kind of teaching, right? Is that you co-create something together. So, but I guess I think that there's a lot of empowerment that comes with experience, and I would say, instead of being daunted by not feeling like you have a lot of experience, the world is your oyster. Like it's wide open, right? Like it's wide open for you to engage with, to learn from, to curiously like mold in some ways. So I don't know. I always just find like you have like a weird idea that kind of nags in the back of your mind, like, oh, maybe I want to start a fanzine. Like I want to do a thing. I don't know. I want to start a band, or like I want to, whatever it might be, right? Like I want to fix the shed, like whatever it might be, right? Like, or like that neighbor needs they need some like help fixing the stoop on their their front porch or something. Like it can be the smallest thing that turns into an opportunity for creative engagement, and also bringing other people in. But don't let those little ideas like go away. Like they're kind of nagging at you for a reason. And I think it's like I don't know. I feel like never thought I would talk about souls in like an architectural talk, but like it might be your soul wanting to like grow in some ways, right? Like that's how creativity operates. So I don't know if that helps you, but sort of. I just think like feeling in some ways like it can feel daunting to maybe not have as much experience, but you only get it by trying things, So don't be afraid to just try things and like make a bad pie or whatever it might be. I've made like, it literally took me 30 years to like learn how to make what I will say is like, and I know I'm bragging, but like the best chocolate chip cookies, but it literally took like probably like 10,000 batches of bad cookies to be able to like understand the chemistry of what makes a good cookie, So, but you do it because you love to do it. And you just gotta, just allow some space for yourself to enjoy the things that you do, like follow what you enjoy doing. And in that sense, the learning and the teaching will probably come very naturally. People will gravitate to you to want to know, like, how did Maurizio learn how to do that thing so well, right? And that's also how you build community too, because you also, if you get really good at recognizing other people's strengths, and maybe there's ways that you can build on other people's strengths together. I mean, that's basically what office hours is. There's no way that I could teach 38 sessions on whatever topic, I don't know. That's not my, but I know, but I identified a lot of super smart people in the world, and there's so much intelligence out there in the world, and so much experience, and so much like heart that to me is also, it's been interesting with office hours. Like I have a list of the programming that could go on for like forever almost. And that's why it's like astounding to me that there's, relative to the field, so little representation of people of color, like in positions of power, in terms of like winning awards, in terms of anything on that level, right? Like being written about in magazines, because there's like, it's like endlessly fascinating what people are doing. Yeah. So I don't know, just
do it.
Is that just do it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to sell Nike goods.
As a testament to like the magic that Esther brings with her, you've already gotten a message in the chat from Alanis who wants to chat to you, and connect and talk about like learning to teach or, various other things. So,
But yeah, Maurizio, you should come join some office hours. And I'm sure you're going to like, people have made tons of friends already on office hours too. I don't know what everyone's up to. Like I'm bracing myself to like receive some kind of like unveiling of something, but I know people are connecting like with other people, like literally all over the world. And some people have even just like met up. They'll like meet up with people in their own hometown and through office hours. So, come hang out.
Yeah.
And you'll be around like, actually our next speaker's from the UK too. I don't want to like ruin the surprise. That's incredible speaker from the UK. So the time zone will work for you too.
Are you implying I have an English accent already? Okay, then. Thank you. That was really helpful. Thanks.
So our final question, sadly, for this evening, but happily for the question, is from Dalia.
Hi everyone. Hi Esther, really nice to meet you. Hi Manijay, nice to see you again. Thanks for putting this together. Esther, I'm also based in the UAE, so unfortunately have not been in the correct time zone to be able to attend any office hours so far. But I've been following it closely on Instagram, and it's so inspiring. So my question, I was intrigued by what you were saying about eagle vision and mouse steps. So I was just curious about, whether you had an eagle vision for office hours and what that might be.
I do, but I'm a little embarrassed. And also I feel like it would be, this is the thing. So actually in the new year, I'm going to be working with a person that's very experienced setting up nonprofits to talk about exactly that question. And I feel like, and this is also in terms of holding myself accountable, I have to also think about, I think a lot about how much, like what my will in some ways may be very different than what's actually needed in the field. So, and this is why I've brought in this other person who's, very rigorous and disciplined and experienced to help guide me through that process, and we can work together. And so part of answering your question is, yes, I would love to scale this and actually have it be, I think the online portion of office hours is super important. I would never want to like discard that. And I'm really sorry to hear that you haven't been able to join. We're trying to have more like different time zones. Like I'm trying to have like what would be the equivalent of East Coast time in New York, like lunchtime sessions. So people on the other, but it's like classic with office hours too. People will like be joining. You see like the moonlight outside. There's like 5 a.m. or whatever, right? And people staying up at all hours. It's incredible. And I feel so guilty constantly. And I'm also like so mystified they can stay awake for an event like that. But so my hope is that actually that we can provide online content still and get the funding to be able to involve more mediators, more people, more of a community, a kind of staff, basically, of people that can kind of run things on that level and continue this programming, because it doesn't seem to me that it seems like there's like more to explore through that. But I also I do sort of have aspirations of thinking about what an academic, but not academic, a para-academic, unclear, para-institute, like unclear situation would be like, where we could offer a kind of really radical education around world building, involving just incredibly interesting people from different fields. Like that to me would be like, that would just be incredible. So I don't know, maybe I'll I put it out in the world, so maybe I'll manifest it now. But I would love that. And I do recognize too that that would be, on the one hand, an incredible experience, but also very geographically tied and rooted. So for these reasons, I'm wanting to really think carefully about sort of what do people really need right now in some ways, and also based on the feedback that I get, and also sort of what's feasible. So I don't know if that's sort of, without giving it all away, that's sort of my eagle vision. And by the way, eagle vision, mouse vision comes from a sociologist named Martha Beck, who's a little bit of a self-help person, but she's kind of good. But she's trained as a sociologist, so you can just lean on that if it's too woo-woo for you. But I find the eagle vision, mouse vision, Maurizio, actually, maybe this is your Maurizio, that's a good, actually, that would have been a good answer for you. is that you think about your ego vision of what you would love to see in the world, the kind of community you'd like to build or whatever it is. And then you take mouse steps. You just take the next, what's one action you can take today towards that thing? And you keep toggling back and forth between ego vision and mouse vision. So, and that's basically how office hours started. It's like, what can I do today? I can open up this InDesign document and I can make a layout, and like, okay, that's my office hours work today, right? And slowly the work builds and it becomes a thing. So anyways.
I think that's like such an inspiring and a terrific note to end this session on. But thank you so much, Esther. This was like so incredible to just hear so much about office hours from your experience. And it felt very meta to do an event about where an amazing series of events came from. And I'm really glad that you got to speak about it because it was just so insightful. And I can't wait to see how you take this forward. I think the world needs para institutions and kind of para projects to like break down some of the problems in these kind of systems. So just thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. It's kind of felt like an office hours a little bit, like interactive, which is nice.
I'm going to try and do a kind of mass unmute so we can give you a round of applause. Just to end.
Woo!
Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.